being a mistake though, because I got really distracted by the other books I was reading. Hey, welcome to my channel. My name is Jessie, and today I'm telling you about all the books I read in January for my January wrap up. To start, I think I had a pretty good reading month in January. I read 10 books, and I read 3 out of the 5 books on my January TBR, so I did deviate from my TBR quite a bit. I also went ahead and DNF'd 2 books this month, one with the intention to go back and finish, and one with no intention of finishing. But I guess really to get started, we'll talk about the one book on my TBR that I didn't get to at all in January. I was meant to read A Nimber in the Ashes by Scribd here in January, but I just never got around to it. I want to read the entire series in one go, and I just never really made the time to sit down and read the whole series, and I kept putting it off. And so because of that, I didn't get to A Nimber in the Ashes this month, but I do hope to be getting to it sometime in the next couple of weeks or months, because this is a series I'm still really excited to read. Next, I did DNF 2 books in January. The first book I DNF'd was A Heart So Fierce and Broken by Bridget Kimmerer. I read A Curse So Dark and Lonely, I think in the summer of 2020, and I liked it, but I didn't love it, and I hadn't really made any plans to keep going with the series. And then I saw that A Heart So Fierce and Broken was on Scribd as an ebook, so I decided to go ahead and read it. And I think I was around a fourth of the way through the book, give or take a little bit, whenever I DNF'd it. I didn't like the way it was written compared to the first book. First, I don't like it whenever like the new characters just take over the story. I wish that, you know, if the book was going to be told from new characters' points of view and that it was going to have so much focus on the new characters, that would have been like a novella or something and would have had more focus on Harper and Wren. The book, I think, had 1 chapter by Harper and 1 chapter by Wren at the very beginning of the book. And then after that, Gray and a new character, their points of view alternated. And I kind of went ahead and flipped to the end. And I think Wren had a POV at the very end, but I didn't like that. That kind of annoyed me. To make matters worse, Wren and Harper both kind of seemed out of character compared to the first book. In the first book, Harper was, you know, pretty headstrong and resilient and outspoken. And Wren, while he was like harsh in the beginning, he kind of, you know, after spending time with Harper, he kind of settled down. And in this book, Harper wasn't herself. She was a lot more subdued than I remember her being in the first book. And then Wren was a lot more harsh than he had been by the end of the first book. And I felt like I just didn't like that. And it was hard to get into. And so I've DNF'd A Heart So Fierce and Broken with the intention of probably not finishing it. I'm probably not ever going to pick that book back up. So I probably won't finish the A Curse So Dark and Lonely series. The next book I DNF'd in January was This Close to Okay by Lisa Cross Smith. I read the first 60 pages in one sitting and I really enjoyed it and I was really liking it, but it was one that I didn't want to rush through. So I decided, you know what, I'll go ahead and start an ebook and kind of read them at the same time. That ended up being a mistake though, because I got really distracted by the other books I was reading, and it took me a couple of weeks to get back to This Close to Okay. And by the time I went back to it, it felt like I needed to start it over, and I wasn't really in the mood to restart the book and reread the first 60 pages. So I do still want to get back to this book. I think sometime in February or March, I do intend to reread the first 60 pages and start from there, because this is a book I'm still really excited to read and really excited to, you know, see how it goes and what actually happens. But the first 60 pages were really good. It was really interesting to see how Tally and Emmett met. I do think the way they met is kind of terrifying. I don't think I could, even if the stranger was in danger, I don't know if I could just take a stranger to my house. It was really interesting, those first 60 pages, and I do intend to go back and finish it. Now we can talk about the books that I actually finished in January. The first book I read in January in 2021 was The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. I think I started it last maybe 2 or 3 days of December, and I kind of stretched it out to make it last where I finished it the first 1 or 2 days of January. That way I could make sure I counted it as a January read, because it was such a good book. I could have easily finished it in one sitting if I'd had enough time to just sit down and read it in one go. I loved that book so much. Stella's character was so interesting, and just how she ended up in the situation she was, where she needed help becoming comfortable in a romantic relationship. And then I loved how like Michael was patient and sweet with her even before he found out she, I think, had Asperger's, or she's at least on the autism spectrum. He was really sweet with her and patient and didn't rush her, or also didn't try to shame her for any of her quirks. And I really liked that. It was definitely like a really sweet romance. It was really light and fun for the most part. During the third act breakup, I didn't like that part so much, so I wish they would have talked to each other more, but at the same time, I could see why both of them didn't think they could talk to each other. But it was a really sweet book that I ended up rating 5 stars. The next book I read in January was Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas, and this book ended up being a 4-star rating for me. This is another book that I absolutely loved. I loved reading Adriel's story. His story was so interesting. His family wouldn't accept him for who he was, so he took matters into his own hands and did it himself and succeeded. I also love that even though Adriel summoned the wrong ghost and that Julian ended up being the one with him instead of his cousin, that Julian was really accepting of Adriel, and while Julian was a little hot-headed, Julian did, never question Adriel's identity and accepted him. And I really like the way they kind of started falling for each other throughout the book, but it couldn't work because, Julian was supposed to be dead. And then I will say my only complaint, and it's not a huge one because I think the complaint may be because of my age, because I'm not really the intended age group for this book. But I will say my only complaint is that I thought it was a tiny bit predictable who the villain was. Once you meet the villain, I feel like from there it's pretty obvious who it is. But I only took a star off for that because it may just be my age. I may just be too old for this book. But I did love this book and I really enjoyed it, and it was a lot of fun to read. The next book I read was The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, and I read it as an ebook on Libby, and I also rated it 4 stars. It was a really interesting book because Nora, she essentially, and this is a trigger warning, she did try to commit suicide, and now she's in this space between life and death and kind of seeing all the ways her life could have played out. And you kind of know from the beginning that it's likely going to end a certain way with her learning a certain lesson about, accepting what she's got or something like that. And it's really interesting because every small decision she's made in her life has led to all these other possibilities of what her life could have been like. And it was really interesting because you get to the end of the book and she's in this one life where she had accepted, some date from some guy, and everything just worked out, and it's this really nice idyllic life, but for some reason it just isn't the life. I think it's the one she spends the longest amount of time in, and then in the end she's drawn out of it and she ends up with a different life in the end than the one that you for a little bit think she might end up in. It was just so interesting kind of seeing, her thrown into these lives where she was herself, but she wasn't given, any background knowledge about what was going on in this life. There's a couple of lives where she was married and she's just thrown into meeting her husband. There's a couple of lives where she has kids and she's just thrown into meeting her kids. There's a couple of lives where she's famous for one reason or another and she's just thrown into learning about herself with the fame. But the lives where she's famous, it's a little bit easier to learn about her life because, she can Google herself and she'll find a few more answers. But it was a really interesting book and the concept was really interesting. I don't quite know why it wasn't a 5-star rating for me, but something about it just didn't feel like a 5-star read. And I haven't been able to put my fingers on it, but it was a good book and I did enjoy it. The next book I read was We Are Okay by Nina LaCour, and I rated this one 3 stars. I'm trying to figure out where I heard this was sad, because while it was sad, I thought it was the type of sad that would make me cry and it'd give me a good cry out, and it wasn't. It was a good book, but it was a 3-star book because just a lot about it didn't hit me the way I expected it to, and maybe that's why I rated it 3 stars, and maybe that's my own fault because I expected too much from it. It was interesting to read about Marin's experience, about her life living with her grandfather and why she lived with her grandfather, and then you go through what happened to make her leave her home and how that affected her, and it was interesting. And I like the way it was written. I like books that are written kind of where there's a little bit in the present and then there's a little bit in the past that kind of ties them together. I do like that style of writing, but just looking at this book, it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't what I was wanting or what I expected, and so because of that, it ended up being a 3-star rating. The next book I read was You Must Not Miss by Katrina Leno, and this one ended up being a 4-star rating for me. I really enjoyed this book, so much more than I thought I would. I kind of went into this one with the hope that I would like it, but the expectation that it might not be quite as good as I would have wanted it to be. It was a little weird. There was just so much going on. There's so many people who have wronged Magpie in the last 6 months, and I do think one of the people she takes her anger out on didn't really deserve it because they were one of the ones who did try to keep giving her second chances even after she kind of proved she wasn't taking them. And I thought the world of Nier was so interesting. I do wish, however, that there had been a little bit more time spent in Nier, but I do wish that a little bit more of the story had actually taken place in Nier and that she could have spent more time there and seen how that compared to her real world. But the time that she did spend in Nier kind of showed this idyllic life almost where everyone treated her how she wanted to be treated and all the bad stuff that had happened in the past 6 months hadn't happened. And then in the end, she finds out that she can kind of use Nier to her advantage to get revenge. And I will say plenty of the people she got revenge on deserved it. One person didn't necessarily deserve it. But I do think this was a really good book and I really enjoyed it. So one of my goals in 2021 is to finish a bunch of series that I've already started or catch up on ones that I've started that aren't finished yet. And one of the series that I started last year was the Percy Jackson books. And I'd read the first two whenever I was in, I think, junior high. And I reread the first two last year. So this year, the last three were all available as ebooks on Libby, and I went ahead and rented them. And I finished the Percy Jackson series this month, or in January. First, I read The Titan's Curse, which ended up being 4 stars. I really liked all the characters that were introduced in this book. The Titan's Curse part was really interesting, waiting to see which Titan it would be, or who was going to be affected by the prophecy, because it's never who you think it is. But like once you get to a certain part, you kind of recognize who it might be after they get into this underground thing or something. I don't know how to describe it, but it was really interesting. I really liked that book. And then after that, I read The Battle of the Labyrinth, also by Rick Riordan, but that one was only 3 stars for me. It was good, but I wasn't as interested in it as I was The Titan's Curse, or as I remember being as interested in the first 2 books. So it didn't hold my interest as well, but I liked it. And then lastly, I read The Last Olympian, also by Rick Riordan, to finish the Percy Jackson series, and it was a 4-star read. I thought it was a really strong ending to the series. I like Percy's terms for the gods after he finishes everything he's supposed to do and the prophecy goes through and everything. And I really liked it. I thought it was a strong ending, and I kind of wish I had read it whenever I was in junior high or even early high school and finished it then. I think it could have been like one of those series that is potentially influential whenever you're a kid, but it was really good and I really enjoyed it. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Bride Test by Helen Wong, and it's the second book in the Kids Quotient series, and it was really good. It was such an amazing book. I almost didn't listen to it because I get a little nervous to listen to some genres on audio. For example, fantasy, I don't normally like on audio because it takes a little bit more for me to focus, and I prefer audio books for contemporary books. But I wasn't sure how I'd feel listening to a romance book, especially a romance book that has some sex scenes in it. Like, I wasn't sure if it would, like, how comfortable I'd be listening to it, but it was fine. It was really good. In The Bride Test, Esme is brought over by Kai's mom, because Kai, he's on the autism spectrum as well, like Stella was in the first book. His mom is worried that he's never going to find love because he's not really actively trying to find love on his own, and so she makes a deal, you know, you try this one girl, and if it doesn't work out, I'll never do it again, but you have to at least try. And so Esme's brought over from, I think, Vietnam, and it starts out the book with she's trying really hard to get Kai to fall in love with her, and then as she realizes that might not work, she decides to find another way for her to kind of work hard and bring her family over. And I really liked her work ethic and how hard she was willing to work to find a way for her family in Vietnam to come to the US with her. And I really enjoyed that part. And then I also liked Kai's character because he genuinely believed that he was not capable of loving anyone. But as the book goes on, you can clearly see that he loves and is very interested and cares for Esme, but he can't see it. And he can't see it because he doesn't necessarily show love in the same way as most other people, and he doesn't process it in the same way as most other people might. At the end of the book, it all works out, and it was such a good book. It was really sweet and cute, and I really liked it. And I also now can't wait to read the 3rd book. I think it comes out, I think sometime this spring, and it's from, I believe, it's about Quan, who is Kai's brother and Michael's cousin from the first book. The last and final book I read in January was The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, and this is a novel in verse, and it kind of goes through Michael's experience in life as a gay man, and as he grows up and learns more about his identity and how his identity affects him, or how other people affect him because of his identity. And it's really interesting. For the most part, it seems like his mom and sister are fairly supportive, or mostly supportive, and he does eventually find friends who are mostly supportive of him. And it's about his experience, you know, from the time he's a young kid, he realizes, you know, he wants to play with Barbies, and his mom, you know, tries to accommodate the toys he wants, but also she's not really comfortable, you know, letting him take the Barbie out with him because of how other people might perceive him. And then, you know, once he gets to middle school and people find out he's gay and how people treat him after that, or then once he starts college and he ends up joining this club of drag queens on campus and realizes that he loves drag and is interested in drag, and just, it was such an interesting book. It was so good, and I loved the poetry format. I don't read a ton of books written in verse, but all the ones that I have read in verse I really tend to love, and this was no different. Anyways, those were all the books that I did not get to, that I DNF'd, and that I actually read in January. Like I said before, I think January was a pretty good reading month. I read 10 books, and most of the books I read had pretty good ratings. But anyways, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Let me know what books you read in January, if any of them were the books I read, if you read any of them even not in January. and feel free to like and subscribe, and I will talk to you guys later.